Kumlan la Blat Gemara. This is Tzim Gedalia's Daf Kuf Gimel. We are up to 2 dots, 5 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said, Troshim she'amru. This that we said that if you have rocks on the field and you accept a certain amount, right? I said I want to buy a base. I'm going to purchase a base car that's 30 saw, and they were there, rocks, whatever it is, a certain amount you're going to tolerate. And what's that amount? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. We said if it's less than 10 tefachim deep, less than a brox, less than 10 tefachim high, the sales are valid sale. So what are we talking about? How much? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Troshim she'amru base arba kavin. Told you the ratio of 4 kavin to 30 saw. 30, each saw has 6 kavin, so 30 saw has a multiple of 6, 180, and 4 kavin will tolerate, which means 2.2%. Amar Ugva says, but these rocks have to be spread out a bit, because if they're all together, then there's a significant section of the field that you cannot use. So, if a saw is 50 by 50, so 4 kavin would be like 33 by 50, a sizable amount of land that you cannot use if it's all bunched together. But how spread out should it be? Says it has to spread out a little bit in an area of 5 kavin, which isn't that much greater, but it's at least a little bit spread out. You can work a little bit around it. We need that these 4 kavin should be scattered around the majority of the field. The field is 30 saw. We need that these rocks should be spread around in an area of 16 saw. 16 saw, the majority of the field have some of these rocks spread out like that. Then people don't mind. It doesn't really impede what they're trying to do in the farm. Says the Gemara, have a question. What happens? Okay, there's 4 kavin. So if you have 16 saw, if you space it out equally, you'll have a quarter of a kav in each saw. 4 kavin has made each kav a quarter is 16. So you spread over 16 saw. So what happens? You have 9 of these kavin only in 4 saw, and the rest, and the rest of them, you have it, the rest spread out to the 16 saw. Do we need it equally spread out, thinned out over the 16 saw, or it doesn't matter? As long as you have it spread out over 16 saw, even though you have a bulk of it in one part and the rest are just thin little pieces, is good enough. Teiku, we ran the question. Of course, Rabbi Yirmiyah couldn't help us. Rabbi Yirmiyah came along and asked the question. But even though Rabbi Yirmiyah was thrown out of the yeshiva in Daf Chov Beis, when he asked the question over there, was it what happened to chicken? Is one is 50 amas if it's one inside one, and was it on Daf Chov Gimel on Beis, and one leg of the chicken was within 50 amas of the chicken coop. The dovecot one belongs there or not, and one leg is outside, and they threw him out of the yeshiva. So now 80 pages later, he's back. He's back in yeshiva. And boy, this is his question. Okay, so what happens? We're assuming it's all a straight line, spread out over 16 saw. So we say, okay, you can work your way around. What happens if instead kishir is like a bracelet? So because it's like a bracelet, it's round, it makes it a bit hard. You can't work in a straight line. You have to wedge your way between these little stones. Makes it a bit more difficult. Is that still considered tolerable or not? And if you tell me that's tolerable, what about kishurma? What about if it's like I guess a shura? The picture here is a little bit inaccurate. What about if it obstructs me from going? If it's a straight line, so therefore I cannot really go. I have to work my way through, break this line the whole time, back and forth, and go around the stones. What's it in then? Is it still acceptable? What about Itztadin Mao? What about, let's say it's like, if you look at the picture here on the left in the Rashbam, what happens if it goes like a V shape? If it's a V shape, and this makes it much harder, because at least a straight line is one area, one line, you can somehow or another work your way through it. Here, there's 2 places you have to work your way through. What would it then be then? What about a kalton? What about like a zigzag? What would it then be then? That makes it you have like to work your way through 4 different spaces. In all these cases, Teiku, Mashiach will come and answer the question. Tana, we learned. What happens Im hoya sela yechidi. Let's say it was one rock. Afilu koshu. I don't care what size it is. Ein nimded ima. If it's one rock, we said before that if it's less than 10 tfachim, it gets included in the sale as part of the land. What happens if it's only one rock? Doesn't matter what size it is, but it's right outside of the field, adjacent to the field, and I guess contiguous to the field and is touching the field. So even though that little rock is small, less than 10 tfachim and so on, because it's outside of the field, it's not considered part of the field. It's not included. It's only the only time we say that the rocks are included in the sale is if it's inside the field, not if it's outside the border. Okay, so Gemara continues. Boy Rapapa. So Rapapa asks a question. Mufsik offer b'tayim. Now, what happens inside? It's right at the edge of the field, and there's a little bit. It's right at the edge of the field. It's inside your field, and it's right next to the border, and but less than 3 tfachim away from the border, between this little rock and the border. Do we say that it's like mamish on the border, or do we say it's inside your field that's included? Another question. What about offer milmata v'tzum milmayla? Let's say the sand up above this rock, and the rock is right beneath it, or the rock is above the sand, and do we say because the sand there is considered part of your field, or do we say because there's a rock there as well, it's right next to the border, it's not really considered part of the field? So do we focus on the soil, and therefore it's all included, even though there's a rock on top of the soil? Who cares about the rock? Or we look at it as the soil, and it's soil. Or do we say, no, the rock is the most important part, and therefore it's not included in the same, and they don't get measured in? Mishnah continues, base koir offer, I'm selling you the size of a base koir of soil. And then he says, mida bechebel, exact measurement. He's telling you, I'm going to give you exactly 30 saw. I'm going to measure it. Then, no, not a fraction less, not a fraction more. Pich is koshu. Even though there's only a minute amount, less than 30 saw, yinaka. What you do is you deduct. So you paid an X amount of dollars, and now it's a slightly less than that for 30 saw. You deduct that amount from the 30 saw. And now there's a question, we learned a few times already, and we actually learned just 2 weeks ago here as well, that Rava said that anything, even though we have the laws of Eino, when it comes to price, we said up to 6 is tal, your meichel and so on. But when it comes to measure, mido or mishkol, if you consider a measure or a weight, it has to be exact. Anything less than that, it doesn't work. So l'chayda, what's going on? Why is it the sale falls apart? So how come over here we say that he just deduct the money? L'chayda, the whole sale should fall apart. So the Rashbam makes a big chiddush, and he says that law of Rava is only limited to metaltal, to portable items, not to land, not to karka. And by karka, you don't mind if it's a little bit less. You're perfectly happy to accept it. So we don't say the deal becomes null and void. Many Rishonim argue, including Taisa on the next page, and they say there's no difference between land and metaltal. The Rava is saying that you have to be exact. You have to be exact. But one shot here is that there's a difference whether I told you I sold you 30 saw and I measured already. It turned out it was less, so he deceived you, and the deal falls apart. But if he didn't measure it yet, and he says 30 saw, then even Rava will agree that deal remains. That's one shot Tosfos gives. The Rashba gives another shot, but let's continue Gemara. Says the Mishnah further, the Im Amar, if he adds the clause, Hein Chaser, Hein, yes, we had this before in the Gemara. If he says Hein Chaser, Hein Yeser, he says, I'm selling you 30 saw, slightly more, slightly less, then you accept even less, or the Moich accepts even more, but how much? Even if, let's say, the less is a quarter of a kav per saw, which basically means a quarter of a kav per saw basically means 30 saw. So that is a quarter kav per saw. That means 7.5 kavim, which is far greater than the 4 kavim we learned before about a rock. It's 7.5 kavim to 30 saw. It's like 4%. That if I said hein chasad, hein yasad, then up to 4% you're prepared to accept. Less than what you thought you're getting, when the Moshe is prepared to accept more than he thought he's selling. Higiu, the deal is a deal. Yoisem mekan. What happens if it's more than that amount? Then yasa cheshbon. Then you make a calculation. In other words, let's say if it's more than the 30 sub and more than 7.5 kavin, you calculate how much extra it is on the base code. And you have to pay already, not just for the surplus, maybe pay for the whole excess amount. The Gemara continues. Remember, we had this whole discussion before. How much do you pay once you went beyond the what's acceptable? Do you pay just for that amount? Do you pay for everything? This came up there as well. Make a calculation. Mahu machzilai. What does he? When you say calculate, what do? You don't say the deal is null and void. Mois. You pay. Let's say you got more than your 30 saw and more than 7.5 kavin extra. You have to pay now for that entire amount that's more than 30 saw. But the imrotza, it's up to the meicher. If the seller says, you know what, forget it. Machzilai kaka, give me back the 7.5 kavin that you have the surplus. I want it back. So if the meicher can take his land back, so why did we initially say give him his money? Because sometimes the excess amount is you need a minimum of 9 kavin, let's say, to make it worthwhile. If it's only 7.5 kavin or 7.6 kavin, what are you going to do with such a small piece of land? It's not worth your while. So then I would rather have money. You took it. I'm happy you took it. What am I going to do with this little piece of land? But pay me for it. But if it's 9 kavin, for example, the meicher wants it back. He can use it and plant a hobby farm. So it's up to the meicher what he wants to do. She'im shayi besod the base tisha kavin, because if, let's say, for example, you left behind an amount where the excess was like 9 kavin, which is sizable, or begin or in a garden base chatzi kav, or in a garden the amount of a half a kav, which you learned if you're out of the different amounts, or kediva abakiva base rave, or a quarter, which he says is sufficient, worthwhile to you plant your herbs and so on. So then the meicher can say to him, I don't want money, give me back my land, that excess piece of land. If it's an excess, you don't only give back a quarter. Once you give back, you give everything back. Says the Gemara, what happens? The boy will have a question. Base What happens? Okay, the Mishnah gave 2 examples. If you said clearly, you delineated mida bechevel. I'm telling you, I'm giving you an exact amount. Then if I in any way less or more, we have to calculate the excess and work out the money. And if I said hein chaser, hein yasser, more or less, then there's a certain amount that you tolerate. What about you said nothing? You just said I'm selling you 30 saw. You didn't say hein chaser. You didn't say whether it's more or less. More or less. I didn't say that. Nor did I say exact measurements. Mida bechevel. I just said I'm selling you base kor. What happens then? So the Gemara iboilu base kor stam and mine. Toshma, come in here. It says in the Brayse base kor ofrani moichelach. It says in our Mishnah. In the first case, if I sold you a base car, only if it's an accurate amount. Sounds like, and the Mishnah says, Pachas kosher, the slightest difference, Yinaka, you deduct. Yes, a kosher, if it's slightly more, Yachzir, you return. That's what the Mishnah says. Hostama, so you can infer from that. What happened? You didn't say the words midabechebel, that if it's slightly more, slightly less, then too bad. We accept it. Kehain, chaser, hein yesadam. Right? Sounds like it's like you're saying more or less, and the deal remains. So the Gemara said, let's here we see clearly from here that if you don't stipulate midah bechevel, it means more or less. Says the Gemara, no proof, because Ema Sefer, look at the next case in the Mishnah. It says, but the imam if he said more or less, then I feel he give. If you say more or less, then whatever you said is good enough. It sounds like has stammer. So from that you can infer only if he added that clause more or less. But if he wouldn't have added more or less, then the deal falls apart. It's like you say, I'm going to give an accurate amount, which means you can't prove on Mishnah one way or another. Toshma, come in here. Base code of any, the Mishnah says the Bryce says the following: base code of any meichla. I'm going to sell you a base code of soil. That's case number 1. Case number 2. I said, base code approximately a base code I'm going to sell you. Third case is, hein chassid, hein yes, well, more or less, I'm going to sell you more or less. So then the Braisa says, afilu piches reivolasa. Even if there's up to a quarter of a cow per saw, 4%. Or hoisid reivolasa, or you added a quarter of a calf to a saw with a meichel is out. He gave the deal. So what is he clear from here? The Mishnah gives the Braisa gives 3 examples, And the first one is base koid afrani moichlach. He didn't stipulate more or less, didn't say approximately. He said, I'm selling you a base koid, and yet it says clearly here that there's a certain level of tolerance. So it's clear that even without stipulating, it's as if you said more or less. Says the Gemara, no, maybe Hasam Pirushe Kamafarish. Maybe the Bryce is explaining when it says base koid afrani moichlach, base koid. When do we say that it's treated as if you said more or less? Eza base koid, shehika base koid. When do you say that if I say base koid, we'll treat it like approximate? Only in other words, it's not three different cases. The Bryce, case number one, the end of the Bryce explains case number one. When do we treat case number one like case number two? If you said base koid, when do we treat it like kid base koid? Approximately, if you added hein chas and yes. So no proof one way or another. So it doesn't make sense. If you're telling me it's not really three cases, then why does after every case say the words "I am selling you"? It's all one case. You're telling me. We're trying to explain when do we say that a base koid is treated like kid base koid? If you added hein chas and yasser, then why each case, each phrase it says ani moichlach, ani moichlach, ani moichlach? Elalav shmamna doesn't it prove that ani moichel elalav shmamna stomanami kehein chas and hein zami? It's really one case, and the Brais are telling you that if you say base koid, it's as if you said more or less. Shmamna, no, that's conclusive proof. Okay, everyone should have an easy tonus and a gemar chasima tova.